In the winter of 1968, two young children emerged from the Appalachian wilderness after having been missing for 11 years. They were barefoot. Their clothing was outdated, garments that no longer existed. When questioned by the authorities about their whereabouts, they spoke of a house that had been reduced to ashes in 1959. The residents of the town sought answers. Their parents longed for their children's safe return. However, what those twins revealed in the subsequent weeks would permanently shatter their family. And the physical proof, the actual evidence, pointed toward something far more disturbing than an ordinary abduction. This is the narrative that the town of Hollowridge attempted to suppress. This is what unfolds when two children reappear, yet those who come back are not quite the same individuals who vanished. Greetings, everyone. Before we proceed, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep recommending stories similar to this one. The Hollowridge twins, Samuel and Catherine Merrick, vanished on October 14, 1957. They were 6 years old. It fell on a Sunday. Their mother, Ann Merrick, had instructed them to draw water from the well behind their home, a regular task they had performed countless times. The well was situated about 200 yards from the main house, just past a row of oak trees that marked the boundary between the Merrick property and the dense forests of southern West Virginia. When the children didn't return after 20 minutes, Anne went out to look for them. The bucket was there, overturned. The rope still fastened to the handle, but Samuel and Catherine were nowhere to be found. There were no tracks leading away, no evidence of a struggle, no cries for help. It was as though the ground had opened up and consumed them entirely. The search commenced that same evening. Within hours, close to 80 volunteers from Hollowridge and neighboring communities scoured the woods. They searched for 3 weeks. They discovered nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no witnesses. By November, the sheriff had quietly closed the case. Though he never made an official announcement, the Merrick family held a memorial service in the spring of 1958, and Anne stopped talking to her neighbors. Her husband, Thomas, turned to heavy drinking, and the town, as communities tend to do, gradually moved forward. But on January 9, 1968, the twins walked out of those same woods, and everything the Merricks believed about the world fell apart. They were discovered by a truck driver named Dale Hutchkins, who was transporting timber along Route 19 shortly after sunrise. He spotted them standing at the side of the road, two small figures shrouded in fog. At first, he assumed they were mannequins. That's what he later told the police. They were too motionless, too pale. When he pulled over and stepped out, he realized they were children, and they were gazing at him with an expression he couldn't quite define. Not fear, not relief. Something else, something vacant. He asked if they were lost. The boy, Samuel, said they were trying to find their way home. Hutchkins asked where that was, and Samuel said the Merrick farm on Old Ridge Road. Hutchkins knew the area. He had grown up 2 towns over. So, he helped the children into the cab of his truck and drove them there. When they arrived, Ann Merrick opened the door and collapsed. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply dropped to her knees and stared at them as if she were confronting ghosts. And in a sense, she was. The children looked almost exactly as they had 11 years earlier. Samuel and Catherine should have been 17 years old. Yet standing in that doorway, they appeared no older than 8 or 9. Their hair was the same length it had been on the day they vanished. Their faces had barely aged. They wore handmade clothes, stitched from rough material resembling burlap, and their feet were calloused and scarred, as if they'd been walking barefoot for years. Anne brought them inside. She gave them food and a bath. Then, slowly, she began to ask questions. Where had they been? Who had taken them? How had they managed to survive? Samuel did most of the talking. Catherine barely uttered a word. She just sat in a corner of the room, staring at the wall, her hands clasped in her lap. Samuel said they had been living in a house in the woods. A woman had taken them there, he explained. He called her the keeper. At first, she had been kind, feeding them and providing shelter. But over time, the house began to change. The rooms grew smaller, the windows vanished, and the keeper no longer appeared human. He said she started to look like something else, something that only mimicked humanity. Thomas Merrick called the sheriff. By mid-morning, 2 deputies had arrived at the house, accompanied by a county doctor named Paul Everett. Dr. Everett examined the twins, measuring their height, checking their teeth, and taking their temperature. He noted in his report that both children showed signs of malnutrition and exposure, but that their physical development did not match their chronological age. They should have been teenagers, yet biologically they remained pre-adolescent. He had no explanation for it. The deputies asked the children to describe the house where they had been kept. Samuel said it was constructed of stone and wood, with 3 rooms and a cellar, and that it sat near a stream about 2 miles west of the Merrick property. The keeper had kept them mostly in the cellar, he said, though sometimes she allowed them upstairs. He described the smell of smoke and damp earth. Catherine, when questioned, only nodded. The deputies recorded everything, and the next morning they ventured into the woods to find the house Samuel had described. The search party consisted of 4 deputies, a state trooper, and Thomas Merrick, who insisted on joining despite the sheriff's objections. They followed Samuel's directions. 2 miles west through dense forest, past a dry creek bed, toward a clearing he claimed to remember. Samuel had drawn a map the night before, crude but detailed, marking the path he said he and Catherine had taken. The map included landmarks: a split oak tree, a rock formation shaped like a tooth, and a depression in the ground where rainwater collected. All of these landmarks were real. The deputies found each one. But when they reached the clearing where Samuel said the house had stood, there was nothing. No structure, no foundation, no stones. The ground was covered in years of undisturbed leaf litter and moss. The trees were old growth, untouched, their roots deeply woven into the soil. One deputy, a man named Carl Dempsey, later wrote in his personal journal that the location felt wrong, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. The air was too still. Even the birds were silent. There was no evidence of a house, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. They expanded the search, covering a 3-mile radius in every direction. They even brought in a cadaver dog from Charleston, thinking the children might have been held underground in some kind of root cellar or bunker. The dog found nothing. They checked county records for old property deeds, wondering if a structure might have stood there decades ago, long since reclaimed by the forest. There was no record. No home had ever been built in that area. The only thing they found, a detail buried in the official report, was a circular depression in the ground about 30 feet from where Samuel said the house had stood. It was roughly 6 feet in diameter and filled with ash. Old ash, later carbon, dated to somewhere between 1950 and 1960. Someone had burned something large there, but what it was, no one could determine. When the deputies returned and told the Merricks what they had found, or rather, what they hadn't, Anne asked Samuel to explain. He couldn't. He insisted the house had been there. He remembered the door, the windows, the smell of the fire in the hearth. Catherine, sitting beside him, said nothing. She just looked at her hands, Thomas Merrick asked the deputies if they thought the children were lying. They didn't answer, but their silence spoke volumes. Over the next 2 weeks, inconsistencies began to surface. Small things at first. Samuel said the keeper had cooked for them every night, but when asked what they ate, he couldn't recall. He mentioned a clock on the wall, but couldn't say what time it showed. He said Catherine had slept in a bed near the window, but Catherine, when questioned separately, said she had slept on the floor. The details didn't match. Dr. Everett conducted a second examination, this time bringing a colleague, a psychiatrist from Morgantown named Richard Holloway. Holloway spoke with the twins for over 3 hours. His notes, later sealed and released only to the family in 1992, painted a troubling picture. He wrote that both children displayed signs of severe dissociation and possible false memory construction. He noted that Samuel's story shifted slightly each time he told it, and that Catherine appeared to be in a state of selective mutism, speaking only when directly prompted, and even then in fragments. But the most disturbing part of Holloway's report wasn't about the children. It was about Anne Merrick. He wrote that during his interviews, Anne had whispered something to him in private. She said that when the children first returned, she had noticed something about their eyes. They didn't blink the way they used to, and they watched her in a way that made her feel as though she was being examined. She asked if it was possible for children to forget how to be human. Holloway didn't include his answer in the official report. The investigation stalled. The sheriff's department had no leads, no suspects, and no crime scene. The twins were alive, and that should have been enough. But it wasn't. Not for Thomas Merrick. Not for the deputies who had walked those woods and felt something they couldn't name. And not for the people of Hollowridge, who began to whisper whenever the Merrick family appeared in town. Thomas hired a private investigator in March of 1968, a man named Leonard Voss, a former state police detective who had worked missing person cases across the Appalachian region. Voss was thorough. He re-interviewed everyone involved in the original 1957 search. He reviewed police reports, witness statements, and search grid maps. And he found something the local deputies had missed, or perhaps something they had chosen to overlook. 3 days after the twins vanished in 1957, a woman named Judith Kane reported seeing 2 children matching Samuel and Catherine's description walking along a logging road about 4 miles north of the Merrick property. She said they were with a tall, dark-haired woman wearing a long coat despite the warm weather. Judith assumed they were a family passing through and didn't think to report it until after the search had ended. By then, the sheriff told her it was probably unrelated. The report was filed and forgotten, but Voss found it, and he found something else. The woman Judith described matched someone the locals had seen before. Her name was Evelyn Marsh. She had lived in Hollowridge briefly in the early 1950s, renting a small cabin near the edge of town. People remembered her because she kept to herself, buying supplies once a week and retreating back into the hills. In 1954, her cabin burned down. She was presumed dead. No body was ever recovered, but the fire had been so intense that authorities assumed she had been inside. The case was closed, but Voss uncovered something in the county records that no one had connected before. Evelyn Marsh had owned property, a small plot of land 2 miles west of the Merrick farm, the same area where Samuel said the house had been. Voss went back into the woods with a surveyor and a metal detector. They found the property markers, old iron stakes driven into the ground, buried under decades of soil and undergrowth. And they found something else beneath the ash pit the deputies had discovered, buried about 3 feet down, bones, not human, but animal. Dozens of them, rabbits, squirrels, birds, all arranged in a deliberate, circular pattern. The bones had been there for years, possibly decades. Voss took photographs and collected samples. When he showed Thomas Merrick what he had found, Thomas asked what it meant. Voss said he didn't know, but it looked like a ritual, as if someone had been preparing for something. The local newspaper caught wind of the discovery and published a small article in April of 1968, titled, "Bones Found Near Missing Children Case." The article was brief, vague, and buried on page 7. But it was enough. People started talking. Theories began to circulate. Some said Evelyn Marsh had been a witch who had taken the children for some dark purpose. Others said the twins had been living wild in the woods, inventing the story of the keeper to cope with trauma they couldn't process. And some, a quieter group, said the children who came back were not the same ones who had disappeared, that something had taken Samuel and Catherine in 1957 and something else had returned in their place. Anne Merrick stopped leaving the house. She locked the doors at night. She began sleeping in the twins' room, watching them while they slept. When Thomas asked why, she said she needed to make sure they were still breathing. When he pressed for clarification, she didn't answer. But in her diary, found years after her death, she wrote this: "They don't dream. I watch them every night, and they never move. They lie perfectly still, eyes closed. But I don't think they're asleep. If you're still with us, you're already braver than most. Let us know in the comments what you would have done if this were your own bloodline." By the summer of 1968, the Merrick household had become a prison. Anne barely spoke. Thomas drank himself to sleep most nights, and the twins, Samuel and Catherine, existed in a strange liminal space between childhood and something else entirely. They attended school for 2 weeks before the principal asked Anne to keep them home. Not because they were disruptive, but because they unsettled the other children. Samuel would sit at his desk and stare straight ahead for hours without moving. Catherine would draw the same image over and over in her notebook, a door, always a door with no handle. The school counselor tried to talk to them. She asked Catherine what the door meant. Catherine looked at her and said, in a voice that sounded too old for her small body, that it was the way back. The counselor asked, "Back to where?" Catherine didn't answer. She just kept drawing. Samuel was more talkative, but his answers raised more questions than they resolved. When asked what he remembered most about being gone, he said, "The waiting." That's what they did most of the time. They waited in the dark. The keeper would come down into the cellar once a day, sometimes less, and sit with them. She didn't speak. She just watched. And Samuel said that after a while, he and Catherine stopped being afraid. They stopped feeling anything at all. He said it was like forgetting how to be a person, like something inside them went to sleep and never woke up. Dr. Holloway continued his sessions with the twins through the summer. His reports grew increasingly concerned. He noted that both children exhibited what he called flattened affect, a clinical term for emotional numbness. They didn't laugh. They didn't cry. When shown photographs of their family from before they disappeared, they looked at the images as if they were strangers. Holloway tried regression therapy, a controversial technique even then, hoping to unlock suppressed memories. Under light hypnosis, Samuel described the cellar in greater detail. He said the walls were made of stone and bore markings carved into them. Symbols. He couldn't reproduce them accurately, but he said they looked like letters from a language he didn't know. The keeper would trace the symbols with her fingers while watching them, and when she did, the air would change. Heavier, like being underwater. Catherine, under the same therapy, said less, but what she did say was more disturbing. She said the house wasn't always in the same place. Sometimes, during the rare moments they were allowed upstairs, she would look out the window, and the view would be different. Different trees, different sky. Once she looked out and saw nothing but white, as if the world outside had been erased. When Holloway asked her to clarify, she said she couldn't. She didn't have the words. She just knew that the house moved, or that they moved, or that something moved, and reality bent around them. In August, Leonard Voss presented his final report to Thomas Merrick. It was 63 pages long. Most of it consisted of evidence and testimony, but the last 3 pages contained Voss's personal conclusions. And they were damning. He wrote that in his professional opinion, the twins had not been held captive by a human being. He didn't speculate on what had taken them, but he stated that the physical evidence, the psychological evidence, and the children's own testimony suggested an experience that defied conventional explanation. He noted the absence of any structure, the ritualistic arrangement of animal bones, the lack of physical aging, the selective amnesia, the dissociation. He wrote that he believed something had happened to Samuel and Catherine Merrick in those woods. Something science couldn't measure and law enforcement couldn't investigate. He recommended the family seek long-term psychiatric care for the twins and consider relocating to a different town. Thomas read the report in his study, locked it in a drawer, and never showed it to Anne. Nor did he ever speak to Voss again. But that night, Thomas walked out to the woods. He went to the clearing where Samuel said the house had been, and he stood there in the dark, listening. Later, when a neighbor asked why he had gone, Thomas said he wanted to see if he could feel it. The wrongness, the thing his son had tried to describe. The neighbor asked if he did. Thomas said yes. The family fractured slowly, like ice cracking under pressure. By autumn of 1968, Thomas had stopped going to work. He had been a foreman at a lumber mill, a steady job he'd held for 15 years. But after the twins returned, he couldn't focus. He'd stand at the cutting line and lose track of time, staring into the distance. His supervisor gave him leave. His co-workers stopped calling. Anne withdrew even further, talking to herself and whispering prayers under her breath. Prayers from no denomination anyone recognized. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning. The house fell into disrepair, dishes piling up, dust gathering on every surface. The twins moved through it all like ghosts, silent and watchful. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't complain. They simply existed, occupying space without inhabiting it. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles and offered help stopped visiting. The Merrick house became known as a place you didn't go. Children crossed the street to avoid walking past it, and the rumors, the ugly rumors, began to spread. Some said Anne had lost her mind. Others said Thomas had done something to those children during the years they were missing. That the whole story was a cover-up. The cruelest whispers suggested the twins had never really been gone at all. That they had been hidden somewhere, abused, broken, and then returned when they were no longer recognizable. In October, exactly 11 years to the day after the twins first disappeared, something happened that forced the truth into the open. Catherine spoke, not in fragments, not in whispers. She spoke clearly, directly for the first time since she had returned. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Anne, picking at a piece of bread she hadn't eaten, when she looked up and said, "We weren't supposed to come back." Anne froze. She asked Catherine what she meant. Catherine said the keeper told them they couldn't leave. That if they did, the door would stay open, and something would follow them. Anne asked what would follow them. Catherine looked at her mother with those empty, unblinking eyes and said, "She did." That night, Anne called Dr. Holloway and told him what Catherine had said. Holloway arrived the next morning and conducted an emergency session with both twins. He asked Catherine to explain what she had meant. She refused. She said she wasn't allowed to talk about it anymore. Samuel, however, was willing. He said the keeper had given them a choice the night before they left. She told them they could go home, but if they did, she would come with them. Not in body, but in something else. She would live in the spaces they didn't look, the corners of rooms, the gaps under doors, the silence between words. He said she had already started. He could feel her in the house, watching, waiting. Holloway asked if the keeper had hurt them. Samuel said no. She had kept them safe. She had loved them. But her love was the kind that hollowed you out and filled you with something that wasn't yours. Holloway ended the session early. In his notes, he wrote that he no longer believed the children were fabricating their story. They believed with absolute conviction that something had followed them home, and after spending time in that house, he wasn't sure they were wrong. Things began happening, small things. Objects would move when no one was looking. Doors would open on their own. The temperature in certain rooms would drop without explanation. Anne found footprints in the dust on the floor. Small footprints, child-sized, leading from the twins' bedroom to the cellar door. But neither Samuel nor Catherine had left their room that night. Thomas heard voices, whispers. He couldn't make out the words, but he heard them in the walls, in the pipes, in the spaces between floorboards. He started sleeping in his truck. Anne refused to leave. She said she had to protect her children, even though she was no longer sure what her children had become. On November 3rd, 1968, Anne Merrick called the sheriff's department and told them she wanted the twins removed from her home. She said they weren't safe. The dispatcher asked if the children were in danger. Anne said no. She said the children were the danger. 2 deputies arrived within the hour. They found Anne standing in the front yard shaking, her hands clenched into fists. She told them the twins were inside. She told them not to look them directly in the eyes. She told them that if they heard whispers, they should leave immediately. The deputies thought she had had a breakdown. They went inside and found Samuel and Catherine sitting on the floor of the living room, hands folded in their laps, staring at the wall. The deputies asked if they were okay. Samuel turned his head slowly and smiled. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile since he'd returned. He said they were fine. They were waiting. The deputies asked what they were waiting for. Samuel's smile widened. The twins were placed in a state psychiatric facility in Charleston on November 5, 1968. Anne Merrick signed the commitment papers herself. Thomas didn't attend. He'd left 3 days earlier and never came back. His truck was found abandoned on a logging road 20 miles north of Hollowridge. Keys still in the ignition. Driver's door open. A search was conducted. They found his wallet, his coat, and a single shoe. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. The case was ruled a probable suicide, though no one could explain where he had gone or why. Anne remained in the house alone for 6 months. She rarely ate, rarely slept. Neighbors would see her standing in the windows at odd hours, just staring out into the dark. In April of 1969, she hanged herself in the twins' bedroom. The suicide note was brief. It said, "They're still here. They never left. I can hear them in the walls." The house was sold at auction later that year. It has been through 7 owners since, none of whom stayed longer than 2 years. Most reported the same things: cold spots, whispers, the feeling of being watched. The current owner, who bought the property in 2014, refused to comment when contacted for this story, but public records show he hasn't lived there since 2016. The house now sits empty, windows boarded, yard overgrown. The people of Hollowridge avoid it. They don't talk about it. And they certainly don't talk about the twins. Samuel and Catherine Merrick spent 17 years in the psychiatric facility. During that time, they barely spoke. Doctors tried medication, therapy, electroshock treatment. Nothing worked. They remained emotionally flat, unresponsive, distant. In 1985, when they turned 34 years old, though they still looked no older than their early teens, the state deemed them stable enough for supervised release. They were transferred to a group home in Morgantown. 3 weeks later, they disappeared. No one saw them leave. No one heard them go. Security footage from the facility showed their bedroom door opening at 2:17 in the morning, but no one walked out. The door simply opened, and then hours later it closed. The beds were empty. Their belongings were untouched. A search was conducted, but it was half-hearted at best. The staff didn't want to find them, and in truth, no one really looked. The case was filed as a voluntary disappearance and quietly forgotten. But there were sightings over the years. A gas station attendant in Kentucky said 2 children, matching their description, came in late one night, barefoot, wearing clothes that looked handmade. They didn't speak. They just stared at him until he looked away. And when he looked back, they were gone. A hiker in Tennessee reported seeing 2 figures standing motionless in the woods, watching him from a distance. He said they didn't move for 10 minutes, and when he tried to approach, they turned and walked into the trees, vanishing without sound. A truck driver in Ohio said he picked up 2 hitchhikers on a foggy morning. A boy and a girl who didn't say a word the entire ride. He said when he dropped them off, they walked toward a forest that wasn't on any map. He watched them until they disappeared into the fog, and just before they vanished, the girl turned back and waved. He said her smile looked wrong, like it didn't belong on a human face. The official records say the Hollowridge twins are still missing. The case is cold. No active investigation, no new leads. But the evidence, the real evidence, tells a different story. It tells a story of 2 children who walked into the woods in 1957 and something else walked out in 1968. It tells a story of a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who may or may not have existed, who may or may not have been human, and who may or may not still be out there, waiting for the next children to wander too far from home. The house Samuel described was never found. The keeper was never identified. And the question that haunted Anne Merrick until the day she died remains unanswered. If the twins who came back weren't the same ones who disappeared, then what happened to the real Samuel and Catherine? Are they still out there somewhere in those woods, trapped in a place that doesn't exist on any map? Or did they become something else entirely? Something that wears the shape of children but isn't. Something that walks the back roads of America, hollow and patient and waiting. The truth is, we don't know. We'll never know. But every now and then, someone reports seeing 2 children by the side of the road, barefoot, silent, watching. And when people stop to help, when they ask if the children are lost, the children always say the same thing, they're trying to get home. And then they smile, and the people who stop, the ones who offer them a ride, never talk about it afterward. But if you ask them, if you really press, they'll tell you one thing. They'll tell you the children's eyes were empty, like there was nothing behind them, like they were looking at you from somewhere far away, somewhere you were never meant to see. The Hollowridge twins are still out there. Maybe they're looking for home, or maybe home is looking for them. Either way, if you see 2 children standing alone on a dark road, barefoot and still, don't stop. Don't look too long, because the keeper keeps what she takes.